So in addition to these previous three arguments, liberals have often argued that the promotion of democracy is also a worthwhile aspect of humanitarian intervention. They argue humanitarian intervention tends to occur in dictatorships where people lack the democratic means to challenge their governments by themselves. So this is why they need that kind of outside or external support in order to challenge governments who may be abusing human rights. And liberals would argue, well, if a byproduct of humanitarian intervention is to remove a dictator and introduce democracy, then this can actually pave the way for peace, prosperity, and stability in the future, which of course are all good things in their own right. There's a basic liberal argument that democracy is a necessary foundation of peace and of prosperity. It goes to Kant's idea of the democratic peace. He argued democracies don't tend to go at war with each other. So if you can introduce a country to democracy, so the argument goes, then you're likely to help bring about peace in that country. Furthermore, prosperity is a result, it's argued, of democracy, and furthermore, if people are given a kind of democratic process, an electoral system, a parliamentary system, then this produces stability because there's less likely to be festering resentment and so on, and that stability can attract investment and lay the grounds for prosperity and economic development and so on. So that's the democracy promotion argument. We could also develop the argument for humanitarian intervention by the point that, well, other institutions arguably are not effective at upholding human rights. So therefore intervention is necessary. If we think about the other institutions we've studied, things like, let's take, for example, the International Criminal Court and the various ad hoc UN tribunals that have been set up to try people for war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. Well, we looked at one of the arguments against these, that they're only really effective, they can only operate with the cooperation of the states in which suspects are located, right? Because they rely on national police forces to hand over suspects, people they want to put on trial. So this is a kind of weakness of these mechanisms. Omar Bashir, for example, of Sudan, he's got an arrest warrant out for him from the International Criminal Court, but because he lives in Sudan and he's the president of Sudan, no one's going to hand him over. So there are limitations to the ICC based on that. We look at Libya, for example. The International Criminal Court did have a warrant out for the arrest of Libya as well, but in the end, it was only humanitarian intervention that was unable to ensure that Gaddafi was captured and then immediately executed. The ICC's arrest warrant alone would not have been able to do that. If we look at other organizations, human rights NGOs like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, the European Court of Human Rights, the International Court of Justice, none of these institutions have the power to enforce their recommendations or their rulings and so on. So this is another aspect to the argument in favor of humanitarian intervention. The other mechanisms in place, the other institutions that exist to uphold human rights simply are not effective. And finally, a final argument we can make in favor of humanitarian intervention, and this will be in response to claims by opponents of intervention that there don't exist any clearly agreed grounds when humanitarian intervention is permissible, which makes such interventions open to abuse. Supporters of intervention in response to these claims would say, well, actually now there do exist clear criteria for establishing when intervention is justified. These are the criteria I mentioned already, established by the ICISS, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, called the Doctrine of the Responsibility to Protect. And their criteria, remember, two criteria in which intervention is permissible and actually necessary: to prevent large-scale loss of life or to prevent large-scale ethnic cleansing. Those are the only two grounds. So you could argue, well, and again, this has been adopted by the UN General Assembly. It's very important in 2005. This doctrine, which could suggest, it could be argued, well, there are now universally accepted criteria for humanitarian intervention and for when such intervention is permissible. So those would be the basic arguments for humanitarian intervention. But like I say, the basic overall argument is the argument that it saves lives. And it's a basic moral principle. If we can save lives, then we should do so. So how would one argue against such a basic fundamental moral principle? Well, the argument of opponents of humanitarian intervention in the main the main argument would be that previous interventions have tended to do more harm than good. And again, let's look at the examples here. So if we look at even Kosovo, in stark contrast to intervention in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya, Kosovo is often presented by liberal interventionist supporters of humanitarian intervention. Kosovo is presented as the kind of success case. NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999, they argue, put an end to genocide and ethnic cleansing. In fact, if we look a little bit deeper into what actually happened in Kosovo after the intervention, it's not as simple as that. It's not as clear-cut as that. After the intervention, Yugoslav forces were forced out, and the KLA, the Kosovan Liberation Army, the rebel group that the Yugoslav army had been fighting, was basically brought to power under a different name, but with the leaders of the KLA became the leaders of the new Kosovan entity. Those